Jennifer Sness here, watching News 24 Live. I'm joined in studio by our resident doctor, Dr. Darren Green. Today he's answering your social media questions. Hello.
Good day, good day.
Today we're talking about seizures. A lot of people want to know what causes seizures, and if they don't experience seizures, they have friends or family members who do. They don't know. And a lot of people actually don't know what to do when the person is having a seizure, which I think is quite important. So why don't you take it away?
Sure. Well, seizures, the other words that we use to describe seizures are fits or convulsions. And not everyone that has a seizure or a convulsion has epilepsy. And when people hear the word epilepsy, it has a stigma attached to it, and people really think it's a death sentence and that they can't live normal lives with epilepsy. On the contrary, if people understand the mechanism of the disease, they will realize that it's a treatable condition and you can lead a normal life. There are many top sportsmen, top role models, that are involved in leadership roles that are epileptic, and when the public actually find that out, they are blown away to realize that there are role models out there that manage to live with epilepsy and be successful and significant in their lives. So starting off just with a seizure, what happens is it can present in many different ways. The typical one that we know of, that we see, is when someone actually collapses, falls to the ground, and then starts jerking. What we as medical people call tonic-clonic jerks. So the tone is increased, the arms and the legs can become quite stiff, and then they start jerking with twitching movements of the arm or the leg. This is on a spectrum. You can imagine if there are tonic-clonic seizures, you can even have a small twitch of the face or the muscles in the face and so forth. It's even possible to have a seizure and not lose awareness or consciousness. Did you know that?
No.
In other words,
what happens in that case?
In other words, if you have what's called a focal motor seizure, someone's busy twitching away with an abnormal signal, and I'll explain how that works in a minute, they can actually be fully aware, hear what's going on in the surroundings, and be aware of the arm actually twitching and not lose consciousness. And that's actually a seizure that's occurring. So people need to understand there's a spectrum of disease, and it ranges from a simple staring episode, an absence, which indicates basically there's a disturbance on the surface of the brain. So the cells of the brain communicate on the surface of the brain. They communicate by sending electrical signals to each other. The left and the right brain communicate with each other. There are connections between them. The front part of the brain and the rear part of the brain also communicate with each other. That constant flux or flow of messaging and communication is magnificent and enables our brains to function the way it does. However, when there is an area of the brain that emits an erratic signal, or that balance is disturbed on the surface of the brain, of that electrical activity, that's when a seizure is precipitated. Now you get obviously different types of seizures. You can have seizures that occur due to damage on the surface of the brain, and there are hundreds of things that can cause damage to the brain, from a shortage of oxygen through things like stroke or direct trauma, sports injuries, concussions, etc. Infections like meningitis as a child leave scar tissue behind and then can affect the conduction of signal on the surface. So you get those, and then you get primary epilepsies that are associated, for example, with genetics and families, where you're born with a tendency to develop seizures and you're at risk of that. Interesting to note, however, is that understanding the mechanism and area of your epilepsy, where it originates, helps us treat it. So often you'll find in the workup of seizures, we look at simple reversible causes of a seizure first before diagnosing you with a specific epilepsy syndrome. We look at things like sugar control. Someone with hypoglycemia, low sugars, can develop with a seizure.
Really?
And someone with high sugars as well. If there are electrolyte disturbances, with the salts in the body like sodium and potassium, can also lead to seizures. Calcium metabolism is another one. So there's certainly quite a few things that can lead to seizures that are reversible and treatable. When it comes to the epilepsy syndromes itself, one often includes in your workup a structural analysis of the brain itself. So you go and look basically at the structures of the brain, particularly the temporal lobe of the brain in temporal lobe epilepsy and complex partial seizures, and we look at the actual curvilinear appearance at the surface of the brain to see if there's any abnormality, any developmental abnormality, that could have been there from childhood that becomes symptomatic later on. And then we act accordingly in terms of treating you with medical treatment to increase the seizure threshold, for example, and assist with the conduction of that signal between the nerve cells. If, however, you have epilepsy itself that is not responding to medical treatment, and obviously the maximum doses for the different categories of drugs that have side effects, and you end up using large amounts of volumes of these anti-epileptic drugs with variable success. Some people respond beautifully and they're controlled and they can carry on with their daily lives, but there are that group that don't. Then you have really zoomed in specialists, neurologists that combine their services with neurosurgeons that actually find the focus on the brain where the abnormal signal originates, and then do what we call epilepsy surgery on the patient in trying to remove that focus. And that's quite phenomenal. Depending on where the erratic signal originates will determine the risk, obviously, of operating there and having, obviously, side effects like language areas or motor function and so forth. So how we map out where the signal originates from is by using a test called the EEG, which monitors the conduction of that electrical activity on the surface of the brain with electrodes. Looks like a helmet that you put on your head. And you know, we monitor the waves and can see which part of the brain has slowing of the waves or poor emission of the waves. And then we treat accordingly.
Now, what should you do if your friend or family member has a seizure in front of you?
Good. So you need to firstly make sure that they are safe. If it's near the edge of a cliff or building, on a rooftop, obviously you have to make them safe first. So prevent them from injuring themselves. If they're going to roll about and there's sharp objects around them, and if they're going to thrash around, they run the risk of head injuries, lacerations, etc. So first, make sure the environment around them is clear. Then make sure their airway is not obstructed. Now, a lot of people make the error of putting their finger in someone's mouth who's having a seizure, you know, to try and prevent them from swallowing their own tongue and keeping the airway open. A lot of people have lost their fingers that way because the person can't help it. They're clenching and biting down and so forth. So you normally try to keep the person in a safe position, turn them onto their left side, which is the recovery position. Make sure if there is anything in the mouth like food, sure, you can try and do a sweep, but don't go and put a sock in the person's mouth to keep the mouth open, for example. That could suffocate them. Generally, the seizure lasts a few minutes and then it arrests and stops. There are ever those rare occurrences where the seizure can be continuous, and that's called status epilepticus, where it's in a medical emergency to call an ambulance and get that person transferred to an emergency unit for assessment.
Thank you very much.
It's an absolute pleasure.
If you have any questions for Dr. Darren Green, let us know what those are in the comment section below, and we'll see you next week.